This is going to be week 4 and the last one of our installment. We've been looking at Psalm 23, and we've been looking at the whole idea of God being the good shepherd. So let me start this morning. Has anyone read the book The Hiding Place by Corrie Ten Boom? Anyone? Yeah, a few of you. I'm surprised not more. Okay, so this is a really great book. So Corrie Ten Boom, in case you do not know who she is, she wrote this book, and basically that was her experience during the Second World War. She was a Dutch Christian, and she was hiding Jews during the Second World War in Holland. And her and her family, they all got arrested and they got sent to a concentration camp because of this. And so they went to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and they endured a horrific time while they were in there. And tragically, a couple of weeks before Corrie Ten Boom and her family would be released, tragically, her sister Betsy, she died. And so you can find all of this in this book called The Hiding Place, and she talks all about this. And there is one particular story in this book that really stands out in my mind. And she talks about how it's 1947, so a couple of years after the war ended, and she is there and she's speaking at a church in Munich in Germany. And she's speaking on the very subject of forgiveness. And she was saying at the end of the time that she had been talking about forgiveness, a man came up to her at the end of the service, and he comes towards her with his arms stretched out and a big smile on his face. And she recognized this man instantly, that he was a former Ravensbrück guard at the concentration camp. And not only that, he was the cruelest guard in the whole of the camp. And he comes to her smiling, and he comes to her with his arms open, and he tells her that he has now become a Christian, and he knows that God has forgiven him for what he has done, but he needs it to hear from her herself. And he asks her with arms outstretched, "Will you forgive me?" Wow. I want you to think about all the emotions that she must have gone through in that moment. She understands the love of God. She understands forgiveness. But there she is, face to face with one of the people who you could say indirectly was responsible for her sister's death. And after all that time that she was in the camp, being beaten and being stripped and being humiliated time and time again, being starved of food. And there he is saying, "Will you forgive me? I have become a Christian." And I appreciate her honesty. And in her own account, she asks God, she says, "Jesus, I cannot forgive this man. He's standing there right in front of me." She said, "Give me your forgiveness so that I can forgive him, because I can't forgive him myself." And it was a living reminder to her. It was a living reminder of the camp. It was a living reminder of her sister's tragic death. It was a reminder that even though the war was over, even though she was no longer in this concentration camp, it was a reminder that the enemy had not left the room, that the enemy was still around. And yet something amazing happened. She said that as she asked Jesus to help her with this forgiveness, she said there was a sudden change. And in that moment, she received this peace and this strength to extend her hand to him. I think if we're honest, we need to ask ourselves, if we were in the very same shoes that she was in, if we were in the same position, would we have been able to extend those hands of forgiveness to that man? But I think the truth is, as we are gathered here, which seems far removed from this particular scenario, we recognize that we do not need a concentration camp, and we don't need to be in a war zone to know what it's like to recognize when you feel like the enemy is in the camp, when there is an enemy in the room. And that can be different things for you. It could be a diagnosis that you feel that's out of control, but you know that it's coming in a few weeks' time. Or it could be a conflict with a family member that is not resolved, and you know that the holiday family dinner is coming very shortly. It could be for you, the enemy could be this financial pressure that has not lifted for you, but yet you know that the bills are being sent and they're on their way. Or it could be anxiety or grief or just a broken relationship that is still present, that is still real, and it keeps showing up in your life time and time again. And I think if we're honest, most of us, maybe naturally, we pray to God, God, would you take the enemy from the room? God, would you take the enemy away from me? Would you take this enemy away from would you just remove it so I can be in peace? I think sometimes we think that God has to remove the enemy, that we believe that peace is something that will only come after God has removed the threat from our lives. Or we think that if God would just banish the enemy, whatever that looks like, whatever the enemy looks like for you, and then we will be able to rest. Or maybe we think if God can just fix my circumstance, then I will be at rest, or then I will be able to trust God. But there is this interesting line that we find in Psalm 23 that I think we should focus upon this morning. And so in this famous psalm that often we would just often say at funerals and things like that, it is so rich, and I hope you have appreciated that over the last few weeks. But there is a couple of lines in the second part of Psalm 23 that I think we want to focus on today. It says this. It says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." But it was that line, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Now think about that for a second. It's not saying take my enemies away, but it was saying even in the midst of the storm, even in the midst of being surrounded by the presence of the enemies, allow me to sit at your table, allow me to be there with you in safety and peace, even though the threat has not disappeared. And we must remember that Psalm 23, we attribute this to David, King David, but this was not just poetry for him. This wasn't just he was waxing lyrical, he was having some beautiful words that he put down. He was not writing this from a safe distance. He knew what he was talking about. Before he was a king and before he was dodging the spears of Saul, he was a teenage shepherd on the Judean hillside. And he knew what it was to be a shepherd. He knew what it was to defend the sheep and to protect the sheep from danger. And we kind of get a glimpse of this. We've spoken about this before. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, it talks about before he's about to face the Goliath, the giant Goliath, before he gets to that point, he's talking to Saul, and he says this. He says, "When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, and I struck it, and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. I have killed both lions and bears." He's like, this is the training ground. That was the training ground for me. And Goliath, he's just like a predator. And he's just like another predator that I went after and I struck and I killed and I rescued the sheep. And I want you to remember that he's talking at the context. He's saying that God is the good shepherd. And so when we think about the nature and the character of God, David's saying, if you want to know what God is like, he's like a defender. He's like someone who will protect the sheep. He's like someone who will go out of his way. He will leave the comfort zone and he will go and take on the enemy. He will take on the predators. He'll take on the thing that scare you to death. And he is the one that will defend you and he will help you and he will rescue you because it's in his nature. He is a good shepherd and he knows how to rescue his flock. And so David is the one that actually fought predators and he protected the flock. And so David's picture of God is as this shepherd who is preparing a table that we'll get to in a second in the midst of the enemies. And he's remembering exactly what it cost him. If you think about going after a lion and a bear, I would not recommend it. I really would not. And he's just this, you know, teenage shepherd boy who learned to throw a few stones and maybe had a staff to pray. He didn't have guns. He didn't have a bear trap. He didn't have bear spray, I'm sure, right? And so such is the nature of him that he wanted to defend the flock so much that he was willing to leave his own comfort and go and rescue the flock. I want you to hear about the nature and the character of God today through the writing of this psalm. And so, what is this table that he's talking about? Because sometimes we can miss some of this when we're thinking about some of the ideas here. And so what is the table? So there are two ideas that I just want to highlight this morning. One is the fact is this shepherding image and what theologians have looked at and they call the tableland. And the second image is this image of hospitality, of an ancient Near Eastern culture, what it actually means to sit at someone's table. So let's start with the first one, this idea of the tablelands. And so there is this Canadian shepherd turned pastor who died a couple of decades ago, and his name was Philip Keller. He wrote a beautiful book all about God being the shepherd. I would recommend it if you can still find one in print. But it describes how the shepherds that he observed in the Middle East, in the summer, they would take the flock and they would take them from the lowlands and they would take them up onto the hills. And for the summer, they would take the flock into these high summer plateaus. And they would call them like the tablelands. So that's how it's interpreted. And so basically, they wanted a beautiful place during the summer where they could rest in peace. But before they would ever take the sheep up, they would go up onto the hills and they would make sure that it's safe for the sheep to come. And so they would go and they would make sure that there is no predators. They would make sure that the ground was treated. There was no kind of sinking mud or kind of sand or anything dangerous right there. They would make sure that they cleared away the poisonous weeds. Basically, they would do everything that they needed to do to make sure that the flock could come and they could graze in safety. And so even though they couldn't get rid of all the wolves and they couldn't get rid of all of the predators, but they would make sure that it was safe so that the sheep could spend the summer there grazing in safety while the shepherd looked on. And so there is this idea right now that even though the danger has not disappeared, that the good shepherd, he is able to prepare this environment where you can graze in safety and you can rest in the peace knowing that the shepherd is prepared and he has stood guard so that you could, as the sheep, you could rest in safety and you can graze in safety. And I think maybe there is an idea for some of us here that we think that you need to have the perfect scenario in your life, that you need all anxiety to be gone. You need all threat to be gone. And the truth is, we are living in this broken world, and this side of eternity, we're never going to get there. But God is promising that if you will live under the care and under the protection of the Good Shepherd, even though the threat might still exist, even though there might be still things that stress you, and there might be still things that you would maybe consider an enemy, or consider things for you that actually they scare you, or you make you feel threatened, or make you feel uncertain. God promises that even then, the Good Shepherd, if you will welcome him into your life, if you will follow the Good Shepherd, even though the threat is still there, he says he will give you his peace and he will give you his assurance and he will bask on you with his love and his grace and his protection between now until the time that you meet him in eternity. That's a beautiful image. And so for some of you who are praying that all the bad stuff goes, I want to say, go ahead. It's a good prayer, but it might be a wasted prayer. Because God often saves us in the midst of the danger. And even though there are predators hanging around, he takes care of us in that moment rather than removing us from the situation. So that's one of the ideas. The second idea is this image of hospitality that we find in near ancient Eastern culture. And the idea is this, that if you are preparing a table for someone to come and sit and eat with you, it was more like a public act or a proclamation of protection. That's a bit of a mouthful. I don't know why I wrote that. But it's like, okay, we're going to set the table for a guest and we're going to invite the guest to come and sit down and eat with us. And it was a way of saying, this person who is under my roof, this person who's come to my table in as a guest of mine, they are under my name, and so they are under my protection right now. So it's basically saying, if anyone is sitting at my table, they have my protection. They are welcome here. And so the table itself became this declaration. Basically, you can't touch anyone who's at my table because they are my guest. And God is saying this about you to your enemies today. He is saying, I'm calling you to come and sit at this table. And we could do a whole 40-week series just upon hospitality and how God invites us to the table, and God produces food and safety and conversation and the best company for us. In fact, you look all the way through Isaiah, that is the image that you find of eternity, that we're going to be sitting around with people that we love, eating the best food and having the best drink and enjoying the company of one another in the light and in the glory and in the presence of God. I think that sounds pretty good myself. But God is saying, I am inviting you to my table in the presence of your enemies, even when enemies are still there. I remember reading one of the commentaries from C.H. Spurgeon, the king of preachers, and he contrasts this. He contrasts eating in the midst of enemies to the way that God sees it. And he has this idea. He has this idea that a soldier, he wants to eat something, and there is a table there for him, but his enemies are all around. And so the soldier is not sitting at the table just enjoying a nice leisurely meal, but the soldier is there gobbling as much food as he possibly can while he's looking around for the threats and the danger. He's waiting for an imminent attack of his enemy who is lurking, and he contrasts that to the Christian who is able even to experience the peace and the blessing of God even while we're living in this broken world. Spurgeon says this. He says, nothing is hurried. There is no confusion, no disturbance. The enemy is at the door, and yet God prepares a table, and the Christian sits down and eats as if everything were in perfect peace. I love that. And so there is this bridge that we have been trying to help you see. See, you can go throughout all of the scripture, and as Christians, this is part of the depth of our Christian faith, is that it isn't just we have the Old Testament and then we were waiting for Christ finally to come and wrap things up. You can find Christ dotted throughout the Old Testament. You can see Christ going and his work and signpost to him throughout Scripture. And once you start reading Scripture like that, you will see Christ everywhere. And I encourage you to do that. But when we get to Psalm 23, and David proclaims, the Lord is my shepherd, you can't help but then think when Jesus comes along, and in John 10, he plainly says, I am the good shepherd. I am the fulfillment of this. I am the Lord the shepherd in human flesh who has come to demonstrate to the world who God really is and what he looks like. He declares, I am the good shepherd. And what does the good shepherd do? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He's not a hireling. He's not someone who's just doing a job for money. He's doing it, and he's willing to lay down his life for the sheep. And so this wasn't a new idea that was kind of made up by Jesus. He was reaching back again into the Old Testament. He's reaching back to Ezekiel 34, where God rebukes the failed shepherds of the Israel leaders who fed themselves rather than feeding the sheep, who let the sheep scatter who let the sheep get devoured. And he's saying that God is not like that. Listen again, Ezekiel 34, verse 11. It says, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak." I hope this is speaking to you this morning. Listen as if God is saying this to you this morning. I will search for the lost. I will bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. And so when Jesus stands up centuries later and says, "I am the shepherd," he is claiming to be the fulfillment of this promise. God himself has come to shepherd his people in the flesh. And Jesus didn't just talk about setting and preparing a table in the presence of his enemies. He actually lived it. On the night before his crucifixion, he gathered his disciples together for what we commonly call now the Last Supper. And I want to remind you that Judas, his betrayer, was sat at the table. Just think about that for a second. You know the very one who's going to stab you in the back, the very one who's going to betray you, the very one that's going to open the door to this horrific death that is awaiting you. And he sat at your table, smiling at you, going along with everyone else, experiencing the food that they ate before Jesus talked about, his flesh and his body. He sat there. You can check this out. Matthew 26 and John 13. The betrayer, the enemy, was sat at the table with Jesus, and Jesus knew this full well. And so then when we think about this line, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies," can I say, Jesus knew exactly what he was talking about right there. He knew exactly. Literally, the enemy was in the room. The enemy was at the table. Now, I'm just going to sidestep for a second to say there's a little bit of a caveat there. We understand from the New Testament that when we are talking about the enemies, we are not talking about flesh and blood. We're not talking about people. Right? It's an important point because sometimes we can we can put all of our kind of expectation that evil is coming from a person. It's not. There are evil forces, there are principalities and powers at work in our world, and sometimes they use human people and they use human flesh to do that, but that is not the source of evil itself. So I want to say, it's not like we're talking about enemies as people. Sometimes they get caught in the crossfire, and so it's not helpful to vilify certain people, thinking, "Oh yeah, they're definitely the enemy." And we see this all the time in our world today. We must recognize there are evil forces at work in our world today. There are things that are standing in opposition to God, and we are told quite clearly through Scripture, we are not fighting flesh and blood. And we are not fighting with sword and with guns and with knives. We are fighting through our prayers, through spiritual warfare. We are fighting every time we stand up for justice, every time we follow Christ, every time we turn the other cheek. Every time we love our enemies, we are engaging in spiritual warfare. And this is an important point to make. But Jesus lived Psalm 23 on the worst night of his life. He set the table in the presence of his enemy, in the presence of his betrayer, and then he leaves, and what does he do? He physically, literally lays down his life because of his love for the sheep. This theme continues. In 1 Peter, he calls Jesus the chief shepherd and calls leaders to shepherd the flock, God's flock, in the way that he did, not for profit or control, but by example. In Hebrews, it calls God the great shepherd of the sheep, the one who was raised from the dead through the blood of an eternal covenant, in Hebrews 13:20. Paul, the Apostle Paul, he calls the elders in Ephesus, in the church in Ephesus, to be shepherds of the church of God. And so the good shepherd doesn't just protect us from a distance. Jesus, he goes ahead of us into every room where the enemy is present and the enemy is sitting. So now, let's circle all the way back round now to Corrie Ten Boom. And let's think again about her stood in this church. She's just preached about forgiveness. Now she has to live it. Now she has to do perhaps the most difficult thing in her life, and she needs to forgive this man who made her life a living hell, and which led to the death of her sister. But the interesting thing that we read in this story is she didn't wait for that memory to fade. And she didn't wait until it no longer hurt. And she was in a good place, a strong place where she could forgive him. But in that moment, she asked God for courage, and she asked God for faith in the presence of her enemy in a similar way that we will do. And she explained that the moment that she trusted God, she didn't feel it, but she knew it was right. And so she asked God for faith to be able to do that. It says the moment she did that, the joy that flooded her in that handshake, she says, was almost overwhelming. And she said, I had never known or experienced the love of God so intently at that moment as she did in that moment of obedience, where it stopped being theoretical and she physically had to take the hand of her enemy and her captor and forgive him. Sometimes we think the same. We think, well, maybe when I'm stronger or when my life is a little bit better, there are going to be people that I can forgive, or there are going to be circumstances or things that have been done against me that I will be able to forgive. I want to say it's a step of courage and it's a step of faith to activate forgiveness, maybe when you don't feel it or when you feel like everything has not been resolved in that moment. You see, it's not the absence of the enemy, but it's the presence of the shepherd in your life that's going to help. He is the one that will give you the strength. And the result will be his peace, his forgiveness, and an overflowing cup, according to Psalm 23. And so while the threat of the enemy and while the threat of the valley of the shadow of death might be overshadowing your life right now, and it hasn't disappeared, I want to say this with all of my heart. I want to push you towards the Good Shepherd. I want to push you towards the one who loves you, who is preparing a table before you. Even though the threat has not disappeared, but he is the one that is able to set that table and invite you to the table to eat in perfect peace, even though we're still this side of eternity. And so I would ask you today, where in your life are you waiting for the enemy to leave the room before you'll believe God can give you peace? Maybe there is a situation. Maybe there is something from you. You're waiting for God to remove it. And God is saying, I can give you peace in the midst of the storm. It could be for you that you're waiting for that diagnosis to change before you'll trust God with your health and your future. Maybe you're waiting for that relationship to be fixed before you think, yes, I'll be able to forgive. Maybe you're waiting for the final financial pressure to lift before you believe that the Good Shepherd will be able to provide and help you through. Maybe you're waiting for the anxiety to go quiet in your head or your heart before you believe that God is going to answer your prayer completely. Jesus he already sat across from the table from his betrayer. He knows exactly what it cost to eat in peace while the danger was so close. And today I believe he would say to someone here, and someone here needs to hear this today, that God would say to you, I am the Good Shepherd. I already went ahead of you. And so I'm inviting you to come to the table, to come to my table and eat in peace, even though there seems so much chaos and mess going on in your life. And if that's where you are right now and you feel that this is something that you feel like your past, but you know deep in your heart there are still things right now that kind of pull on you and pull you in a million different directions. They rob you of peace. They rob you of feeling close to God. I want to say, I would encourage you this week to name that thing in prayer. Be specific. It might be a specific circumstance. It might even be a person who has wronged you. It might be a fear that you're fine and everything's great. But when that thought and that fear comes into your heart and you recognize that that thing is still in the room, it's still present for you, it sends you in a spin. I want to say, instead of waiting for it to leave before you come to God, I would encourage you this week, come to the table, metaphorically speaking. Come to the table and bring it before God and name that thing, because there is a power in the secret. Wherever it's buried deep in your heart, it will never be addressed. The moment you speak it out and the moment you bring that thing before God, you become accountable before God. Whenever you bring it before God, that is the first time and it's the first step for that thing to be dealt with. So I encourage you today, if you feel like there is a predator still out there is a threat that's still out there, I want to say the best thing that you can do is bring that before the Good Shepherd. And by doing that, it's almost like prophetic in the fact that you are laying that before God. And so God, he will say, I am your Good Shepherd, and I will be the one that brings you peace, even in the midst of the threat that you sit in right now. And I'll say, that's not weak faith. That's exactly where David sat. That's exactly where Jesus sat, and that's exactly where he's inviting you to come today. And so I want that to sit with you this week as you think about all the stuff that's going on in your life right now. So let's kind of wrap up, right? So we've had 4 weeks of this. We started in week 1. We talked about the Lord as the shepherd, to Jesus being the good shepherd. In week 2, we talked about following the good shepherd because he wants to lead you to still waters and green pastures. Last week, we talked about how to survive in the desert. And this week, we've looked at sitting at God's table before the enemies are vanquished. And so it kind of goes without me saying that if you haven't already, I want to ask you, do you know the Good Shepherd? I'm not sure, do you know about him, right? Because lots of people know about Jesus. Even people who wouldn't claim to believe faith, they've heard about him, they know about him. I'm asking, do you really know him? Do you know him not just as a good shepherd, but do you know him as your good shepherd? That you'll follow him, that you'll follow his lead, that you will live under his care, that where he leads you to, you trust that it's good for you. And so he will lead you to that place where there will be safety, there will be protection, and there will be green pastures and still waters, which some of you I know desperately need in this moment. Is he your good shepherd? If you're here today and maybe you're kind of not sure and you're still working and you're working through your faith, I want to say, even if you're exploring, I would just encourage you, keep on exploring, ask those questions, do that research. I would say, if that's for you today, I want to say, go and grab one of these Explore faith cards. We're going through a lot of these. I think probably some of you are taking them and giving them to their friends as well. And use that QR code, read this and watch this, or maybe put it into the hands of someone who you might need to say. I want to say, start and continue exploring your faith because there is always this next step for us all to start putting our trust and our hope and our faith in the Good Shepherd. Church, would you stand with me today? I'm going to ask the worship team to come back. I'm just going to